Thank you very much. Thanks for the kind introduction. Thank you all for being here. Hope you've had plenty of coffee, so I don't have to worry about putting you to sleep here, but good morning. So, as she just said, I'm going to talk about operational imperatives, and also something else you may have heard about, both if you follow any Air Force press. The Secretary's big thing over the past close to a year has been re-optimization for great power competition. So I am not going to bore you with a bunch of bureaucratic government organizational stuff, but I am going to hit on the GPC aspects of this, the great power aspects of this, because of the implications for all of you from an investment perspective, and specifically what I want to get to is about how do you actually scale, and how do you take early investment in early stage technology and develop it into real programs with real money. So that's what I want to leave you with today. I'll warn you, I'll hopefully start on a high note. I'm going to be a little bit of a Debbie Downer, and then hopefully bring you back up and end on a high note. So without further ado, oh, and I was told that there is a QR code that will also be available at the end that if you want to download, hopefully you'll read it afterward instead of while I'm talking, unless you're really good multitaskers, that has a narrative that describes each of the operational imperatives. So this will be up again, I think, at the end. So you already got a little bit of introduction to what the operational imperatives are, but we've been doing this now for 3 budget cycles. It started with the fiscal 24 budget cycle. And you can see the point right on top. And unfortunately, it's not a flat table, but I got my prop here. For those of you who can read it, it's a play on the Army-Navy Academy rivalry for football. Go Air Force, beat China. Now, we're not trying to be warmongering. We absolutely do not want conflict. We don't believe at any stretch conflict is inevitable. But we have found ourselves in a situation where increasingly we're concerned about our ability to stay competitive against peer competitors. And that's what motivated the operational imperatives. I want to be very clear for this audience. We're not an innovation fund. We're not an R&D activity. We are not modernization for modernization's sake. We're about what are the capabilities the air and space forces need to be competitive against the peer challenger. It's very operationally focused. We aren't locked into this problem that many of you may have experienced, especially if you've got more traditional DoD background that says, hey, I got this great idea, but there's no requirement. Well, we've had the people that make the requirements and make the warfighting concepts embedded as product teams in the people developing the concepts for operational imperatives. It's open-ended in terms of technology, but it's also open-ended in terms of the operational concepts and how we go about solving these really hard operational problems. We have been very successful to date in what I'll call Pentagon and Washington level success. So far, we have moved over $40 billion over a series of years toward completely new operational capabilities. At the pace at which Washington moves and the pace at which DoD creates new things, this is huge. Now, the caveat on this is again between excitement and Debbie Downer. I hate to say it, but I gave this same pitch last year, and nothing has changed because we still don't have an FY24 appropriation. I'm hopeful that within the next days that we will, and I have to say that parts of Congress have been incredibly supportive. All 4 committees that look at DoD have been unbelievably supportive of the operational imperative. So I want to thank Congress for that support. But we got to get an appropriation. None of this is real yet. It's all on paper. All right. Now the good news is I am hoping, very hopeful, that within the next week or so, it is going to be real from a fiscal perspective, and then the floodgates will open, and I need all of you to be ready to work it. We're continuing to work additional activities. We've got a budget that's also hopefully going to be released next week with some more stuff in 25. And right now, as she said in the introduction, my day job has been focused on continuing to do work, and we've got a submission for 26. So the cycle continues. However, I've got a second full-time job, which is that bottom bullet. And this gets back to the optimization for great power competition. So a lot of what we've been focusing on to date is capturing the lessons learned of how we have been executing the operational imperatives And how do we make sure that that becomes an enduring mindset that the department can continue with beyond having any individual personalities like Secretary Kendall? So these are the list. Again, you have the QR code where you can download them. I highlighted a couple of new ones, and this gets a little bit to our thought process of how we're looking at perpetuating this. We started out with 7. These first 7 operational imperatives, and I'm not going to read it to you or brief every single one. These original operational imperatives, frankly, sprung out of Secretary Kendall's head from his decades of experience in DoD circles and strategy circles. We already started an interesting process where questions beget questions. As we looked across the operational imperatives, we realized, we're coming up with great ideas, but we can't do that without additional supporting things. So in DoD, everything has to have an acronym and a buzzword. We created additional study teams that we call the cross-cutting operational enablers, COEs. They're still basically operational imperative studies. Looking at additional problems inspired by the original operational imperatives and further understanding and learning about what the problems are we're trying to solve. So you can read what they are. I highlighted 2 that are new for this budget cycle. One wasn't really new. We started last year looking at problems associated with electromagnetic warfare and management of the electromagnetic spectrum. And one of the big insights, and this gives you a little bit of insight into the thinking of how we approach these OIs, we said, that's a function. That's a technology. That's not a real warfighting capability. Why are we doing electronic warfare? It's to go break bad guys' kill chains and to create some level of information dominance. So it's still heavily focused on electronic warfare and electromagnetic operations, but we have refocused that particular COE team on essentially counter kill chain. And so that's been a really big emphasis area for this year. The other one was a new one. We realized, and I want to highlight it because there might be people in the audience who have capabilities very relevant to this. Certainly the commercial world does. Training and test. We very quickly realized that with all of the new capabilities being brought forward by the operational imperatives, that we didn't have really the infrastructure and the mechanisms to do test and training for all of them. And in addition, training has always been one of the big differentiators of the U.S. military. So that became an additional focus area for this year. So these are the operational imperatives. I'm not going to belabor this, and it looks like some of the white lettering didn't quite come out well on the screen. But this is an attempt, and you can, I think, get the charts later. This is sort of our thinking, actually from last year, on what in our minds are some of the big dual use opportunities, where there may be commercial opportunities that align with this $40 billion in new programs. And again, I want to emphasize, we're not, unlike things like AFWERX and SpaceWorks, funding things based upon technologies. We're getting to real weapon systems, real mission systems, real military capability, but we're going to need this kind of technology as part of it. So I'll just pick on a couple. You're going to hear a lot later on about proliferated space when we have the space panel coming up next. A ton of things on here about data and software and how we manage data, how we build and deploy software, how we manage networks, how we manage the flow of data. All of that's critically important. Sounds an awful lot like Industrial Internet of Things or Industry 4.0. A lot to be learned there. Autonomy. We have a huge push in autonomy. One of our very major programs that's actually already getting going despite where we are with the budget process is something called collaborative combat aircraft. Now, these are not swarms of drones. These are full-scale combat aircraft. Think of them as fighter aircraft without pilots in them. They are meant to be affordable mass. So, they're not throwaway. Call it order of magnitude $10 million, so it's not chump change. But it's attritable. Compared to an F-35 or a B-2 or something like that, we're not going to cry if we lose a CCA. And we can look at new types of missions that they can do where we can accept more risk in the missions because they're attritable. And by the way, very importantly, they don't have a pilot on board that we have to worry about loss of human life. So those are the kinds of things we're very interested in. a lot of the other new stuff that comes out that you don't think about as being an operational imperative. How are we doing supply chain and logistics? We got to be resilient. It's very complex to begin with, and oh, by the way, someone's attacking our supply chains. How do we be resilient against that? How do we map that against contested logistics? A new one that has popped up this year from current studies. Interesting things in advanced manufacturing. Yeah, in fact, I was having a sidebar with a couple of different people here earlier just today. We need to get to the point where we can think about families of systems, not just in terms of big programs that complement each other, but when I go buy something, I buy a new airplane, I buy a new missile, I buy a new XYZ, that I can build variants of that very quickly and very rapidly without having to start a blank sheet design and a completely new program from scratch. And oh, by the way, pay for it as if it's a blank sheet design and pay for it from scratch. So we're looking at things where we can increase the diversity of the force, increase the diversity of the capabilities, have a lot more options for the warfighter for effectively the same amount of cost. And we're going to do that by applying a lot of digital technologies to how do we cycle quickly on building these new variants. And then we really need ways to do surge manufacturing. I'll say as an aside, and this will be, I'll come back to this when I talk about some of the business models this is motivated. I don't know how many of you have heard of this, but there's something that the Air Force has used for years called the CRAF, the Commercial Reserve Air Forces. And this is basically contracts. For those of you who are in DoD and you have to use DTS to plan your travel, and it only lets you use certain airlines, that's actually because of the CRAF. We issue into sustainer contracts with commercial companies that says for just a little bit of keep alive retainer plus preferential treatment and things like government employee travel business, that we reserve the right to, if a crisis happens, you're going to provide us additional capacity for airlift. And all of those aircraft with American and United and Delta and FedEx, not to mention some of the unheard of, mom and pop, charter kind of things, all can be available to the U.S. Air Force for operational need, okay? Those are the kinds of models. Imagine that for manufacturing. If I had highly programmable, flexible manufacturing, it would be an incredible advance for our military to be able to get into a craft-like model for manufacturing. So instead of having to pay for a unique factory, where we own the factory for every program and every platform, having its own factory that we have to facilitize and keep fed, imagine if there was a commercial market filling that factory and keeping the factory going, but we could have a craft-like model. It says if a war happens and we need to surge production, that we could get access, both contractually but also technology-wise, to that kind of manufacturing capacity. So these are some of the things that are being stimulated by the OI work. And again, these are not explicitly OI programs, but they are thinking about where there's commercial analog. The last one I want to highlight on here, I mentioned we have the new COE team that's looking at training and test. And of course, the Air Force has a lot of different work in training, not to mention just straight flying hours and pilots in cockpits, but also a lot of work in simulators. That's important. But in today's world, especially, hey, if it's an autonomous aircraft, I don't have to worry too much about pilots doing stick and rudder for the autonomous aircraft. The so-called part task training, the actual skills of flying the planes and operating the systems on the planes, that's becoming increasingly automated and much less relevant from a training perspective. We're trying to push training up the cognitive stack. How do you think about more the decision-making process? Especially, and I'll use another DoD acronym buzzword that hopefully everyone's heard of, JADC2, Joint All-Domain Command and Control. If we're doing massive theater-wide joint operations, very dynamic, lots of moving parts, we don't have the ability to train for those kind of operations, even within one service, let alone across all the joint force. So an example, I'm not saying we have a program for this, but I'm trying to get creative juices going here in this audience. Imagine that I've got something that looks like just a slightly jazzed up video game, like a strategy war game, that is so easy to use. I don't need a big massive exercise and training campaign that only happens twice a year that costs $100 million. This is a piece of software that could be there in a debrief room. So that every time a squadron comes back from doing whatever training in an aircraft they're doing, they can sit down over a keg of beer, bring out their video game, and practice what they would do as a squadron as part of a broader joint force campaign, and work through those higher level cognitive things. And what would be even better if we had a tool like that is not only could we give those warfighters the opportunity for regular, almost everyday reps and sets and get the muscle between the ears really honed up, it also allows you to generate data. Imagine you could collect all the data back from every squadron doing those kinds of games on a constant basis, and then you start applying AI analytics to that. And you might say, that thing they did in I won't throw any squadron names out to embarrass people, yeah, in Squadron XYZ, that looked really stupid. And that's not according to what they're trained to do. Guess what? It was awesome. That's that kind of discovery that you can imagine, not only honing up training, but learning from, possibly using it to feed back into both new tactics and new capability development. So these kinds of things it sounds simple compared to robotic aircraft, but these kinds of things are going to be really important to our future force. So anyway, this is, I'm going to try and leave time for questions in the end. I'm happy to talk more about any of these technology areas that you can't read too well, and anything else coming out of the operational imperatives. But I want to pivot a little bit to what we're doing with perpetuating this and what the implications are for you. So back in September, the Secretary made a big announcement that we are going to re-optimize the Department of the Air Force for great power competition. And people have been running around like mad across the DAF for the last several months. And then in February, the Secretary and the chiefs made big announcements about what the changes are. And so there are a total of 24 new initiatives. It really is focused on the fact that we have an organization that has been built to perfection for efficiency against a low-end threat, based upon a couple decades of work in counterterrorism, counter-violent extremism. And now we're saying, what do we need to do to change the thought process? So yes, it's org charts. Yes, there's some new commands and some new organizations. A lot of it's about how to change the culture, how to change the thought process, how to change the business models. And perpetuating the work we've been doing in the operational imperatives is a big piece of this. So one of the things that I have been tasked to do, as a second full-time job, is develop a new organization within the Secretariat called the Integrated Capabilities Office. And the simple explanation of it is it's going to be a dedicated office to do what we've been doing in the operational imperatives. How do we discover the new? You know, again, from an efficiency perspective, the Department of the Air Force, and frankly the whole U.S. military, is really good that if you have a well-defined mission area and an existing program and an existing set of warfighting capabilities, how do we perpetuate that? And even how do we incrementally evolve it and make it better? We are really, really good at that. But we're so good at that that we don't have a good way of injecting something that doesn't already have that set of stakeholders working that problem set. So another way to think about the ICO and what we've been doing with the operational imperatives is how do we catalyze, based upon focusing on the hardest, most important problems, how do we catalyze new ways of warfighting and the capabilities we need to support the new ways of warfighting, and then making sure that there are real executable programs and the resources carved out of the budget to make all of that real. Simple job. So that's what we're doing with the Integrated Capabilities Office. Now again, I warned you, hopefully you have a lot of coffee. I don't want to go any further. If you really want to ask in Q&A, great, but I don't want to go much further into the GPC bureaucratic organizational structure. What I want to do is talk about implications of this notion of the new, and how do we create new, true warfighting capabilities, and put it in the context of things you all really care about, which is how do you go from a startup and early stage investment to becoming a unicorn in DoD and getting big money in a program of record. Now, here's the warning. Here's where I become a little bit of a wet blanket. All right. We do a really good job, and we're here in the spaces of places like AFWERX and SpaceWorks that have incredible capability and good resources for getting things started. The challenge, and I lived this when I was at DARPA as well, is the so-called valley of death. How do you go from a new idea, a new concept, a new that doesn't have existing stakeholders, doesn't have an existing program, doesn't have an existing budget? And the way I think about this, that hopefully is useful for those of you who are not DoD and come more from an entrepreneurial world, is in terms of addressable markets. I mean, have you gone to a B-school entrepreneurship program, says, you know, every funder is going to say, well, what's your addressable market? Okay, so I come up with a new idea for a flavor of coffee, and I go do my MVP, and I'm starting really small. And I found a couple of early adopters and early users who just love my coffee. All right? Now, that's a really niche product, but a lot of people drink coffee. I drink a lot of it. So you say, okay, there's a whole huge population of people that drink coffee. Not all of them are going to want my coffee, but there's a good chunk of them that I am so certain about the quality of my idea that I think I can get to a lot of them. And there's still a decent population that I've got a business model for how I can get to an initial distribution chain and marketing process where I think I can go from just a couple of people in my initial little pilot project and an initial focus group and MVP to a decent sized initial market. Okay? Here's the challenge on the DoD side of things. So what a lot of our innovation ecosystem does really, really well is make sure that when they are co-investing with you, that there is an operational user focus. They are very religious about making sure there is a bona fide warfighter operator who is there expressing what the needs are. So that's a really good thing. It's a very essential, critical thing. It's not sufficient. Absolutely necessary, but not sufficient. Because the issue is, and again, for those of you who live DoD, you say, oh yeah, of course, you're telling me the obvious. But for those of you who don't, there are many, many different tribes. And the reality is, this is probably not going to be a nice thing to hear if you don't live this. The warfighter, that operator who is telling you, here's a problem I've got, is not the customer. You know, the customer is even on the operational side, the customer might be a different command who is a so-called requirement sponsor, who is deciding that this thing is important enough that the DoD should prioritize resources against it. Okay? And then ultimately your real customer becomes a program office someplace that is taking orders from the requirements command to then go buy something that the requirers told them to go buy. So I could be laser focused on that very enterprising operator who comes into you and says, I got this problem. Please help me with my problem. And they're imploring you with the passion of their operational experience and maybe even examples where there's been loss of life. But the challenge is not only do they not carry the clout of having the money, having the budget, owning the requirements, being an acquirer who can go spend it, but their mission, as important as that operational problem is to them, that mission may be a very, 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 very small mission in the context of what the department really has to deal with, okay? So the punchline in all of that is while the total budget of the DoD looks huge, there's a very small portion of that that's available for any kind of procurement and acquisition. And within that, the trade space available for new really doesn't exist. There is no trade space without some forcing function to force in a new program, and then an operator you talk to may be working a problem that is such a small part of the overall problem space that it doesn't drive that forcing function to force a new in there. Okay, so warning, that's the Debbie Downer part of all this. So what are we doing about it? Okay, and this is where, again, partnership with organizations like AFWERX and SpaceWorks are so important. What they bring into the equation is the impedance match to this kind of environment. People who don't speak DoD, understanding who the commercial players are, who the financial players are. So they form a critical way to go tap not just interesting new ideas, but also partnerships with a lot of the private capital that's out there. So that is an incredibly important part of the problem. What we're trying to do via the great power competition constructs and things we've learned from the operational imperatives is how do we bring a level of mission focus to this problem space that has a chance of busting through that lack of trade space and creating from potentially whole cloth a new mission area and capability area. So there'll be opportunities for me to talk a little bit more about this in the next panel and another panel I'm on tomorrow. So for those of you who have the fortitude, you can be bored by me a lot. But the punchline of this slide is, again, I'll call it a traditional innovation model. You still have the hard-charging, enterprising operator who's coming in and say, hey, I want this thing. But now it's come from the context of a higher level study, like the operational imperatives, where we've said, this is something like we need resilient forward basing, that you heard in the last panel. Go OI5. We need autonomous aircraft to be attritable mass against, to go along with our manned fighter aircraft. Those are really big deal concepts that are important enough from a force design and a warfighting concepts that will create a catalyst for new. So you've got people who can explain to you those kind of problems. And oh, by the way, they also bring, as much as people love grousing about the bureaucracy, it's important. That's how things become real. So they bring with them people who are patch-wearing approvers of requirements. They are bringing with them people who are acquirers, who can write contracts, okay? So they help define that problem. One of the things we're working on trying to figure out is, I call it Goldilocks level of specificity. Because a lot of you have probably suffered from the two extremes. You get one where someone technically defines an operational need, but it is so vague and generic that it leaves too much room for specificity. Now again, if you're coming up with that new flavor of coffee, that might be good enough for you to target a market vertical. But if we're talking about a limited trade space and the government buying process, that level of vagueness probably isn't enough to get you traction. The flip side is, you don't want to turn an innovation environment into a bureaucratic program office where you're overburdened with requirements and people telling you exactly how to go build your thing. So we're looking at trying to define the need at this Goldilocks level of specificity. And then even once, if you hit that sweet spot, after you start developing something and you start learning more, you're probably going to discover it's wrong. So another big part of this model is to build a product team. So if you've got like an AFWERX or SpaceWorks organization that's working to fund some of your work, don't just make it a one and done with that operator and the acquirer. Bring them in, not to dictate how to do things. I call them being tech Sherpas. They're making sure if you're in this flexible trade space that you're still focusing on solving a really big deal operational problem. And then the really magical thing happens that I have to say this. We have a couple pilots we're trying this. I can't declare we have broken the code and have enduring success. But we've got a couple of pretty interesting use cases where we've used this model to put all of the trappings of a formal program of record that, again, because of our archaic government budgeting process, is 2 years away. But putting those pieces in place, that when you have this product team and they're flight following the innovation work, they can do all of the bureaucratic yak shaving that has to happen to turn it into a real capability. So that by the time you finish prototyping work with something like an AFWERX or a SpaceWorks, now you've got all of the program of record predefined specifically designed to print to your capability. And then you'll hear later on today the work going on with StratFi that helps to bridge that gap even further. So this is the model that we're trying to push. Again, we're just piloting a couple different things, a couple initial things here, but I think this is really the way to tap into this community. I'm not going to belabor this one. This is an example of how it inspires new types of business models. And since we have a space panel coming up next, I want to leave some time for audience Q&A. I'm going to kind of gloss over this one. A final question that I'm also not going to geek out on, but a big question in my mind, and this is more to the investors in the room, is the risk profile that you have to deal with understanding how money flows against the government bureaucracy and appropriations process, is a measurable risk model, risk of money kind of model, but it's a very different risk profile than what you would be dealing with in a commercial market. So again, I'm not going to belabor this, but if there are investor type folks that statement resonates with, I'd love to pick your brains later on. So anyway, to finish up my comments and leave a little bit of Q&A, again, hopefully, after bringing you down to the trenches, I've lifted up and given you some hope. I'm not going to say that we have totally broken the code, but I am very excited that we do have a couple of initial pilots for this kind of model to pave over the valley of death that I'm highly optimistic about. So I think we really can do this. I'm excited about the momentum that we have going into this great power. With that, audience Q&A. Yeah. I think there's a microphone coming. Yep.
Thanks for the presentation. My question is really around the technical specification process and what it appears like from someone on the investment side of it. It's been pretty heavily invested for the past 7 years in defense tech. Is when it gets to that program of record and the specs are being written, if it's a program that one of the major primes cares about, they're sitting at the table. It's typically in a classified area, so that limits the number of people, but those specs get written in a way that only Surprise Lockheed can fulfill it. And so that $10 million plane that's autonomous becomes a $30 million plane, and we move on down the road. So is that not correct, or
well? So that is absolutely a problem. I'll call it in the traditional model, because what happens in the traditional model is it's a break point. So in fact, there's an interesting little side story, even involving the big primes. Urban legend that I was able to validate as truth. In the mid-'80s, there was a program called Advanced Tactical Fighter that Lockheed, in this case Lockheed and Northrop, competed against each other. They had working prototypes in about 1990. And Lockheed came with the YF-22 and told the Air Force, you know what? We could this plane that we just built as a prototype is actually really good. And we could take that and shoehorn in some mission systems, and you could have your F-22 right now, call it a Block 0, and then continue to improve it. And the answer was, no. We have process, so we're going to take that as an interesting example in a technical risk reduction. Now we're going to write a bunch of requirements and start over again. Okay. Now that was a big, a decades old, big on big kind of example. The same thing happens today in the innovation ecosystem. You get something funded out of an AFWERX, it produces an interesting prototype, and even if it does find a program of record to land on, the traditional model is we're going to take this as input, start a study, start a new process, et cetera, and you get into that thing you talk about. What we're talking about here is different. This says that you have that Goldilocks specificity up front that still allows people to innovate and define. And the output of it is not just something that's an example. It's like that. It's more like the YF-22. This is something that's good enough that I can call it the Block 0. And essentially, I'm not resetting with a new program. I am immediately rolling into a program of record. In fact, I can't guarantee this for any given acquisition, but an objective here would in fact be, I've got my competition that happens during that initial prototyping phase, so that I don't even have to recontract things. I pick the best prototype, and I just roll that directly into the program of record. There's not a re-adjudicate requirements and all the rest of the stuff you're alluding to. Anyone else? Yeah, back there.
Hi. I may be being a little bit too literal, but the training scenario that you discussed, I did that for first responders and for the FBI dive team.
Okay.
It was instructor-led training, it wasn't virtual, but it would be easy to shift it to virtual. So is something like that like an AFWERX challenge? Do I come and talk to you after? So how does that work?
Happy to talk. So in the model that I described, this is a great opportunity. So we have a team that so here's where it's even a little more complicated for the training and test. We don't explicitly even have a program office, let alone an existing program line that we can point to in that model. That being said, we do have an OI team that's very heavily focused on it, and they've identified this as a high priority budgetary area. So, and again, this is actually a good news story in this case. We're talking about FY26 for the current funding for training and test, as well as that time frame to have a program office that can fund training and test. That's a sweet spot in this model that I described to say, okay, now work with an AFWERX. And we even have a program office that for these command and control related tools might be the voice of the program office that could build a product team around that and start running with that. So I don't want to speak for the AFWERX folks here, but they might come to me and say, hey, what do you want us to do? And then you would talk to them. Yeah, over here.
I'm part of a small business. We went through a SIBR phase 1, phase 2, and the integrated prototype dev team is exactly the type of thing we need. We're actually going to deploy our first phase 3 this month at Allison Air Force Base. But we have no clue how to navigate toward the program of record. We're very new to this space. We've only been doing SIBRs for a couple years. We've been in business for 25 years, so we kind of come at it the opposite way. But how do we get a hold of those people?
So again, I mean, this is probably not a real satisfying answer to your question. The challenge, once you're at the point of a phase 3, you're pushing on the rope because you're already at a point where the majority of the people that define the requirements for the phase 3 are not coming out of program offices or having an operational imperative behind it. They're largely people from the S&T community who have an interesting, good idea, or even from a program office that have an interesting idea. So by the time you get to a phase 3, you're at the point you'd like to transition it, but you're kind of creating a market from whole cloth to a large degree.
Yep.
So this is not a fix to the existing model. This is a new model.
Right.
So in the model I'm proposing, that before someone would go into the phase 1, they would be aware of, hey, here are targets for these problems that are being identified by operational imperatives. And that improves the chance that there's an alignment there, even if it's a new that doesn't already exist.
So in our case, there's a demonstrated need, and there are people that are finding budget for it, but it's also disparate and scattered.
Yeah.
It's like we have to
It can happen. It can happen. My example of the one enterprising operator, that can perpetuate. There are people who will pass the tin cup and they've got a little bit of end of year O&M money. Right. It's not going to get you scaling.
Right.
So it's not a bad idea for companies that are willing to be, I'll say, traditional DoD model of cost reimbursable contracts. You can have a very healthy, sustainable business that way. You're not going to get growth. And so for people who are, you could get growth, but it's going to be slow and incremental. For people that are receiving private capital and their investors are looking for a big ROI and a big multiple, this is the model we need for that. I think we're almost out of time. Maybe one more question? No, that's it? All right, I'm getting the hook. All right, thank you, everyone.